Welcome to the Data for Human Rights module 3.5 on how to set up a survey in Google Forms. So you hopefully have a bunch of people in the room right now who are interested in becoming survey team leaders or supervisors. So hopefully they are already familiar with what is Google Forms, but it is worth just reiterating that it's a web tool that's used to collect qualitative and quantitative data. It's free, it's available for online use only, but we can use it with other apps like Formbox to be able to make it available offline and usable on mobile devices. All of this is covered in module 3.2. So if you have people in the room who are not yet familiar with Google Forms and this Formbox app, you probably want to go back to that module and present just a few slides here to orient people to this tool. What we'll focus on today here is how supervisors will create the forms, but also how they'll use the data that's coming in online as spreadsheets and as summary graphs. So one question that comes up is, when do we use Google Forms versus other tools like Kobo Collect, which you might also be using in your office? So here's some basic guidance. Google Forms is very good for simple, short surveys that don't collect spatial data or don't collect media. So these might include opinion surveys or structured interviews where you're asking one question after the next and recording those responses, for example, as text. Maybe you use Google Forms for quick surveys of people on the street, like vendors, or if you're trying to systematically survey events, like something's happening today, maybe there's a series of protests happening across the city, and you want to collect some same data about what's going on at each of these sites, and you need to set up a form really quickly. Maybe you want to use Google Forms and just kind of have some standard data about what's going on at those events or activities. Kobo Collect is really designed for data collection on mobile devices, so it's got a lot more options. You can collect spatial data, media files, so you can take photos, record audio and video all within the app. It's really well designed for longer surveys. I mean, maybe more than 20 questions. And generally it's used for it's generally used for quantitative or numeric survey data collection, but it really does support qualitative as well with the media options. Some other things to keep in mind. So Kobo Collect is specifically designed for offline mobile devices, whereas Google Forms is specifically designed for online data collection. It's assuming you're using a computer to answer the questions, although you can view it on an app, but it's assuming you're connected to Wi-Fi. The real big strong point here is that it's a very simple interface to create questionnaires. And when you're doing the online version of it, you can also embed videos and images that either instruct the data collector on what they should be doing, really guiding them hand by hand if they're connected. You can also you can show respondents something that they can react to. So you can show them a video, have them react to it in the questionnaire, all online. A lot of the environments where we're working, we don't have that connected. We're not connected to Wi-Fi or don't have data turned on our phones. So we need an offline capability. And for this, we've introduced the app called Formbox, which allows you to display a Google form on the phone offline, collect the data, and have it submitted or synced with Google Drive later on when the data collector is back connected to Wi-Fi. The challenge with Formbox is that some of the Google Form question types are not supported, so you can't collect date and time questions and you can't upload files. There's also some other features that are available in Google Forms that you won't find in the Formbox version. So these, like showing a respondent the photos or the video and having them react, these are not enabled on the Formbox version. It's really a slimmed down version of Google Forms. So now you're with your room of participants or people learning, and you want to just reiterate these points and review with them what kind of data are we collecting in Google Forms exactly. We're collecting quantitative data, things that we can count and measure that are the same response categories, multiple choice, those kind of questions. and text-based qualitative data. So we can collect quotes, we can collect notes as well about what's going on in a setting in a qualitative way, but we're not collecting media and we're not collecting spatial data in Google Forms. And this is a more detailed explanation of exactly the different types of survey questions that you would find in Kobo Collect and Google Forms and where they overlap. So which ones are common to both platforms and which ones are specific to Kobo Collect versus Google Forms. And you'll see, without reading all the details, that Kobo Collect supports a lot more types of questions. And, that includes different qualitative, quantitative, spatial, and other types of questions like being able, or it's not a question, but being able to collect signatures and acknowledgement tick marks and stuff like this as part of the form. So familiarize yourself with this graph in case people have questions. What's helpful, hopefully, is that a detailed example of each of these question types is provided at the end of the slide deck for Google Forms. So if you wanted to see what any of these question types look like in Google Forms, how to program them in Google Forms, and when you might use them in Google Forms, you've got each one of them on its own slide at the end of this presentation to review. Okay, so if you're in the room with people, it might be helpful to just go through some common types of questions that you would see in Google Forms as it is displayed on the Formbox app on the mobile device, since we're assuming that that is how most of you are going to be collecting Google Forms data. So I've just put out, all of the questions are here, but I recommend just kind of working through these, one or two questions at a time, which is why it's paced like this, and reading the question and understanding what kind of response that you're going to get, and also familiarize people with the language of how we refer to these different types of questions in Google Forms. So it's a single line text or a multiple line text question type, or a number question type, or a range question type, etc. So this is a good point in the class to have a discussion about when you would use Kobo Collect versus Google Forms, just in case people are still struggling with when to use which platform. So we've got a few different examples of survey types. So the first one here is an area observation survey, which is meant to collect photos, GPS points, and data at set locations. And so you put the question up, or put the task up, and ask the audience, ask the room, what would you use, Kobo Collect or Google Forms, and why? And so we've provided some responses. Hopefully people will be able to answer these pretty straightforwardly because we've reviewed it already. If you're collecting GPS points or photos, you're going to need to use Kobo Collect. Here's an example where we're doing a remote repeated survey. So there's people making phone calls from an office or home, but they're following up with the same set of households on a weekly basis with a phone call and asking just a few questions over the phone on the topic of food and employment. And this is an example where Google Forms would be a really sensible tool because the survey is short, Google Forms is easy to set up, but also if the data collectors are calling from an office where there's Wi-Fi connection, they can enter the data directly in Google Forms and they don't need to even use the Formbox app. So any of the limitations of Formbox disappear, and you can have more types of questions available to you, and you don't have the limitations of you can't display media, etc. So you can work through these examples with the class, and hopefully it's a lively discussion. Now we're going to work, now we're turning to what the task is for the day. So this is a practical training where we're asking people to recreate several questions from the Module 2 training form. They're going to actually program these questions themselves into Google Forms. And this is a good opportunity to just review some of the language about what types of questions there are. So for each of these screenshots, there's one type of question that's being displayed. And so ask the people in the class, what type of question is displayed on each of these screens, and see if they can get it. And we've got the answers here below. Okay, so there's 3 activities, and the very first activity is to set up a Google Form survey. We assume that you have several computers in the room. Unfortunately, there's not a way to set up Google Forms via an app on the mobile device. You have to use a computer to set up a Google Form. So we're going to be working in teams of 2, or if you've got limited number of computers, you can make larger teams. And you're going to have each team set up a set of questions. These are the questions they're going to program into Google Forms. And when they're done with it, they're going to copy the URL of the web address of the Google form and share it with the rest of the class. So we hope that you've set up a WhatsApp chat at the beginning of the class with everyone's phone number so everyone can easily share these links. I recommend showing this step-by-step video by playing it to the class and then leaving this slide up on the board so that the people in the class can see the questions that they need to program and the response categories they need to program. Once they have programmed Google Forms, the next activity will be for the teams to go to the form of another team using the link and actually try testing the form itself, like entering some data. The data, it doesn't have to be accurate data. It doesn't even have to be sensible data. In fact, you want to encourage the teams to try to enter things that they shouldn't be able to in the questionnaire, just to see if the questionnaire has been well programmed. So they can answer the questions however they like. So like say team 1 will be answering the questions from team 5, for example. And so they'll go to the team 5 questionnaire and try to enter some data. And they want to check, can they leave any of the questions blank? They shouldn't be able to do that. Can they enter a text value where their question is looking for a number or vice versa? Can they enter a number when the question is asking for text? Are there any missing response categories, etc.? So this is a process that is helpful for the teams to kind of be held to account and understand where they might have made some mistakes in the process. So it's a good learning opportunity for one team to inform another about, what the mistake was and how they might correct it. So there's some peer-to-peer learning. It's also helpful to remind people that this process of testing our forms is critical before we send people out to the field to use the form. So we want to do exactly this activity on our own forms when we're making a form. And the third activity is to monitor the data that's being submitted by another team. So, hopefully in the previous task and activity 2, people have tried to submit multiple forms, 3, 5, whatever, but more than one. And now that data will be submitted to Google Drive and start showing up in the the Google Forms responses for the team who designed the survey. So in activity 3, each team is going to monitor the data that was submitted by another team on the response screen, which is being shown on the right. And so the steps are to navigate to their form responses. And then they're going to do 2 things. They're going to open in the top right the little Google Sheets icon, which has the raw data in table format of all the submissions and all the submitted data. And they're also going to scroll down through the graphs for each of the questions. The graphs are summarizing the responses from the table in a visual way. And what you want to have them discuss now that they've started to get familiar with the spreadsheet version and the summary graph version of the same data, have them think about how they might use these graphs and spreadsheets to monitor data collection during the activity. So let's say they're going to want to use some of this to monitor the quality of data as data collection is happening. So usually data collection might happen over several days in a week, like maybe there's 7 days of data collection, and each day you might have data collectors submitting all of the responses they collected during the day. Maybe they submit them in the late afternoon when they're back at the office and connected to Wi-Fi. And so that evening, the survey supervisors or team leaders can actually open up this page and look at the responses and start getting a sense of what was the quality of data collected that day. And by the next morning, they can be prepared to find a team, for example, that might be struggling and not answering things in a complete way or an accurate way. Is team B always answering things in a certain way? Maybe they're not you can kind of see if there's patterns showing up that might be problematic, and you can work with the teams during the data collection activity to see if you can improve the data quality throughout in day 2, day 3, day 4. And also ask the people in the room how they might use some of these, particularly the graphs, after data collection to report results or share results, maybe back with the community, maybe on social media, maybe with funders or collaborators in the community. And finally, it's helpful to share some tips now during this training as people are programming their survey, sharing tips how to minimize the data cleaning they'll have to do later and maximize the quality of the data that's coming in directly from the field. And you can really shape this by setting up a very good survey. So while you're setting up the survey, you want to ask people to consider like illegal or answers that you shouldn't be allowed to enter. So I'm calling them illegal answers, but consider what would be an illegal answer for every single question and see if there's a way to create a validation to prevent illegal answers. So for example, if you're programming a number, so an age, the question is, what is your age? So that should be a number. You shouldn't be allowed to enter a letter or another kind of character symbol. And so there's validations inside of Google Forms that will prevent you from entering anything except a number. You also want to think about short text questions, for example, the name of a community or the name of a street, the name of anything. If you know what community names or the names of streets that are going to be covered in your survey, consider formatting this question as a multiple choice or a drop-down question, not as a text question. And the reason is that when people type in text, they're going to have capital letters and lowercase letters and various versions of the spelling. And you'll get lots of different versions of the same name. And it will be a long process to do all the data cleaning to make all of those names match in the data so that you can actually analyze them, summarize them. So what you want to do now is try to think of any text-based questions and try to make it a multiple choice or a drop-down and predefine as many names as possible. You can always add an other category, and in Google Forms, you can put other and then have somebody type in something that wasn't in the list. So that might be a helpful way to minimize the number of multiple spellings of the same thing. And just to reiterate, test forms before you do field work. Check if it's possible to enter illegal answers into the questionnaire. See how the form looks on a mobile device. Maybe you realize that you've got a multiple choice question and the response categories are really long and they don't look, it's really hard to understand them when you see it on a mobile device. And so that might make you think, oh, I'm going to shorten some of these response categories or just kind of format the question a little bit differently. So it's very clear on a mobile device and you don't have data entry errors just because it was confusing for the data collectors. And this also is helpful to just kind of check the language of the question, the language of the response categories. When you're actually in the field, does it make sense to you? And also, does the flow or the order of the questions make sense? When you're actually playing it on a device, it becomes very obvious that in a way that it's not obvious when you're on a computer screen. So test your form, have other people test your form, give you that feedback. And at that point, your team should be ready to go to the field. Take care. Thank you.